Hello, my dear friends. If the standard of beauty is to look lifeless, would you dare call it perfection? In Victorian times, women were not allowed to be seen eating. They were forced to walk like they had no bones, smile like they had no facial muscles, and keep their feet as cold as ice. Every part of their body had to be smooth, odourless, soundless, and immobile. A glance that betrayed emotion or a scar on their hand was enough to make them feel worthless. Everything was controlled, even the way they breathed. Tonight, you will see what happens when beauty turns women into statues. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If one were to step into the parlour rooms and streets of Victorian society, one of the first things noticed about women would not be their dresses or their jewellery, but their eyes. The eyes were said to reveal the soul, but in this period they were trained and sculpted to reveal something else entirely. The fashion was for sadness. A woman's gaze, if it glittered with tears not yet fallen, was celebrated as refined. The ideal was not brightness or energy, but a perpetual look of longing, as if she had witnessed tragedy and carried it silently. A plain, open expression, too innocent or too lively, was seen as shallow. Instead, the perfect eyes were those that suggested pain, without allowing release. This strange requirement did not arise from nature but from instruction. Girls were told in conduct books and family advice that their eyes should always hold depth. To achieve this, they were encouraged to think of solemn things, to reflect on death, loss, or the fragility of life. The belief was that by dwelling on sorrow, their gaze would acquire a certain wet sheen. Mothers reminded their daughters to avoid expressions of joy that seemed uncontrolled. Laughter was risky because it dried the eyes and brightened the face too much. Melancholy became a discipline. In drawing rooms, men praised women whose eyes looked heavy with thought. Poets wrote about eyes as though they carried ancient grief, even when the woman in question had lived a quiet, sheltered life. It was not the truth that mattered, but the performance of suffering. The more a woman's eyes resembled a portrait of a mourner, the more people considered her cultured and sophisticated. The cruelty of this standard lies in its demand for suppression. Women were told to control their emotions so that they looked sad, but not so sad as to break down. Tears had to hover but never fall. Grief had to be painted, but never expressed. If a girl cried freely, she was weak. If she smiled too often, she was shallow. Only the narrow middle ground of restrained sorrow was rewarded. Such training carried daily consequences. Women practiced in front of mirrors, lowering their eyelids slightly, keeping their gaze soft and unfocused. They learned to avoid looking directly at people, since directness suggested confidence rather than delicacy. They even trained to blink less, because too much movement spoiled the illusion of still sadness. Eyes became ornaments, shaped by will and habit into a mask of permanent loss. The methods to achieve this effect were as varied as they were strange. Some women pinched the skin under their eyes to create redness, imitating the aftermath of tears. Others read tragic poetry aloud before attending social gatherings, hoping the mood would linger in their expression. Some carried keepsakes of dead relatives, not for comfort, but to stir their imagination just enough to cloud their gaze. For many, sadness became an accessory, as essential as gloves or a fan. What makes this practice even more unsettling is that society approved of it openly. Advice manuals praised the tender eye that speaks of hidden sorrow. Fashion magazines printed drawings of ladies with heavy lids and shining eyes, describing them as the height of elegance. Men commented in public on whether a woman's gaze was too cheerful. reducing her value to the success of her practiced melancholy. This was not a secret custom, but a widely admired ideal. The expectation created lasting effects. To hold sadness in the eyes meant to live with it in the mind. Women internalized the demand, shaping their thoughts around death and loss, even when surrounded by life. The gaze became both a prison and a performance. It is unsettling to think how many young women spent their youth forcing themselves into sorrow simply to be admired. Some accounts suggest that even illnesses were romanticized. Pale, watery eyes caused by fatigue or sickness could be praised as beautiful, while strong, clear eyes were dismissed as unrefined. Health was less attractive than fragility. A vibrant girl might be overlooked in favor of one who looked weakened, even if the weakness was feigned. The body's natural signals of pain were transformed into signs of beauty. In the dim gaslight of Victorian evenings, these eyes glimmered strangely. Surrounded by dark clothes and heavy interiors, the wet shine stood out. Guests at parties or gatherings might whisper about who carried the most tragic gaze. It was a contest of sadness, measured by appearances alone. The irony is sharp. A culture that claimed to value morality and purity demanded that women disguise themselves in false grief. The demand for mournful eyes was also a reflection of control. A woman who looked sad appeared harmless, dependent, and passive. Liveliness suggested independence, which was unwelcome. By turning sadness into beauty, society ensured that women were perceived as weak at all times. Their very gaze was shaped into compliance. It is almost absurd to imagine mothers instructing daughters to think of coffins or gravestones before attending a dinner, yet such advice circulated widely. Manuals instructed women to cultivate a pensive air. The private sorrow of loss was reshaped into a public fashion. The gaze became a tool not of self-expression, but of social expectation. The long-term cost of such training is difficult to measure. It must have left countless women exhausted, caught between real feelings and forced ones. To smile naturally was forbidden. To cry honestly was forbidden. And so they lingered in a false twilight state. Their eyes bore the weight of a sorrow they might not feel, while their minds carried the strain of constant suppression. In hindsight, this standard seems cruel and absurd, yet at the time, it was considered elegance itself. Women who failed to master it risked being labelled simple, shallow, or unworthy of admiration. The pressure to embody sadness was as heavy as the corsets that shaped their bodies. The fashion for mournful eyes shows how beauty was bound to pain, turning even sadness into a performance. From here, the gaze shifted to the rest of the body, demanding signs of fragility in every feature. The next cruel expectation was that a woman's skin should look so pale and untouched that it seemed no blood had ever flowed beneath it. The skin of Victorian women was not judged by softness alone, but by its distance from reality. The ideal was a whiteness so absolute that it appeared untouched by blood, sunlight, or labour. Pale skin had long been admired in European culture, but in the Victorian age, the demand sharpened to something harsher. It was not enough to avoid a tan. Skin was expected to carry no sign of pores, no blemishes, no natural warmth. The less it resembled human flesh, the more it was praised. To reach this standard, women resorted to substances that promised a mask of purity. Powders of chalk, rice, or starch were common, but many turned to mixtures that contained lead and arsenic. These powders were applied daily, layered over the face until the living tone beneath was erased. In mirrors lit by dim gaslight, the skin shone a cold, flat white. This was considered elegant, yet the very chemicals that created the look slowly poisoned the bodies of the women who wore them. Advice columns in popular magazines repeated the same message: true beauty meant a face without visible life. Young girls were taught to avoid the sun at all costs. Parasols and gloves were sold everywhere, promising protection from even the faintest rays. Freckles or redness were marks of vulgarity. Families who could afford to keep daughters indoors took pride in their pale complexions, presenting them as proof of refinement. Poorer women, forced into markets and fields, were shamed for their darker skin, regardless of how hard their lives demanded they work. The cruelty of this system lay in its falsehood. Even the women most carefully guarded from sunlight could not naturally produce the ideal. Skin has pores, veins, and tones that shift with health or exhaustion. To erase these signs, women relied on cosmetics that were anything but harmless. Lead whiteners blocked the skin, producing a temporary mask but also seeping into the body. Symptoms of poisoning, headaches, stomach pain, and trembling hands were explained away as nerves or weakness. Few connected them to the powders rubbed into the face each morning. In the crowded streets, the illusion of perfection was powerful. A woman whose face glowed white seemed elevated, set apart from the grime around her. To onlookers, this was beauty. To her, it was often discomfort and danger. The layers of powder dried the skin, cracked in damp air, and left residues on clothing and furniture. Servants sometimes remarked on the marks left behind, but the performance of purity mattered more than comfort or health. Inside homes, the ritual was daily and meticulous. Women sat before mirrors, patting on layers of powder, sometimes mixed with vinegar or ammonia to improve adhesion. Brushes and cloths coated with arsenic-based preparations were common objects on dressing tables. The smell was sharp, the texture gritty, but the final result, a lifeless white mask, was admired. The irony is stark. The very society that praised female delicacy demanded that women cover themselves with substances that corroded their bodies from within. Reports did surface from time to time. Physicians noticed patterns of illness among fashionable women. Their hair fell out, their teeth loosened, their skin erupted in sores. These were the visible costs of cosmetic whiteners. Newspapers occasionally published warnings, yet such reports were dismissed as exaggerations. Commerce carried more weight than caution. Sellers promised safety, and buyers believed. The demand for unnatural skin revealed larger truths about Victorian values. Beauty was never about health or vitality. It was about distance from labour, distance from nature, distance from anything ordinary. The more a woman's skin resembled marble, the more she was praised as refined. Real flesh, with its warmth and marks of use, was judged common. The body was denied in favour of an ideal that resembled death more than life. For many women, this denial created contradictions. In private, they lived with rashes, fatigue, and fear. In public, they displayed the mask of purity proudly. Families boasted of daughters with skin so pale it seemed unreal. Suitors praised brides whose faces looked untouched by the world. Behind the praise lay a truth few dared admit. These standards consumed women's health silently, day after day. Even servants noticed the difference. The white dust of powders clung to sheets and furniture, coating rooms with the residue of vanity. They cleaned these traces daily, but the cycle never ended. The mask had to be renewed each morning, no matter how damaging it became. It is chilling to imagine a household where every object carried faint evidence of poison, yet no one questioned its place. By the end of the century, reformers spoke more loudly about the dangers of toxic cosmetics. Some alternatives appeared, safer powders made of zinc or harmless starch, yet the belief in lifeless whiteness remained. Even as knowledge grew, the old standard lingered. Generations of women were sacrificed to the image of skin that denied reality. The expectation of impossible skin reflects the deeper contradictions of the era. A society that valued morality and order demanded women mutilate their health in pursuit of appearance. Beauty was defined by absence of blood, pores, or warmth, rather than by life. It turned the natural body into something shameful, to be hidden beneath a coat of poison. The standard of untouched skin was not just about appearance, but about control. By insisting that women deny the marks of their own living bodies, society reinforced the idea that they were ornamental, not human. Their health was expendable, their lives secondary to the illusion of refinement. What remains most disturbing is how normal it all seemed. Powdered faces filled parlours and markets. Children grew up seeing mothers and sisters cover their skin with whiteners. Death itself was hidden beneath the appearance of purity. The obsession with pale, lifeless skin shows how beauty became a denial of humanity, turning women into statues rather than living beings. From there, the pressure expanded further, demanding not only the mask of whiteness, but also a face emptied of all feeling. The next measure of beauty required women to resemble dolls, with expressions so fixed that they seemed already halfway to the grave. In Victorian society, the face was not meant to be lively or expressive. Instead, the most celebrated appearance was one that resembled a doll, a surface without emotion, movement, or vitality. This strange ideal transformed the human face into something closer to an object, admired not for its natural warmth but for its rigid stillness. Women were praised when their features seemed carved from wax or porcelain, untouched by the chaos of feelings. A smile was dangerous, a frown was vulgar, and any sign of life was considered a flaw. The training to achieve this effect began early. Young women were encouraged to control every muscle of their faces. They practiced in front of mirrors, holding expressions until their features stiffened. Conduct manuals advised avoiding sudden laughter or raised eyebrows, as these movements left traces in the skin. Instead, the face was to remain calm, unchanging, and detached. In social gatherings, this control was treated as a mark of dignity. Women who showed natural expressions were dismissed as frivolous or weak. To reinforce the lesson, physical tools were sometimes used. Devices that restricted movement around the mouth or forehead were sold quietly in markets. At night, some women wore stiff bands across their faces to prevent muscles from shifting during sleep. Even in rest, the goal was stillness. The effort was not only exhausting but also unnatural, yet the rewards in social approval were enough to keep the practice alive. In schools that trained girls for household roles, dolls were sometimes brought in as models. The lifeless faces, painted with small fixed mouths and wide blank eyes, became patterns to imitate. Teachers described them as pure and serene. Girls were told to sit quietly, studying the figures until their own faces carried the same emptiness. The doll, rather than the living human, was the measure of grace. The pressure carried into adulthood. At dances, women were judged less by their conversation than by the composure of their faces. A bride was praised if she could hold her expression through hours of the ceremony, appearing solemn rather than joyful. Mothers reminded daughters that an uncontrolled smile could ruin years of discipline. The more lifeless a face appeared, the more it was called beautiful. This expectation had harsh consequences. Muscles weakened from constant restraint. Women reported tension headaches and aching jaws from holding rigid expressions. Skin suffered too, pressed flat under layers of powder and oils that preserved the mask. Yet these discomforts were rarely spoken about. To admit pain was to admit failure. The face had to remain calm, no matter what the body endured. Doctors occasionally noted the strange stillness of fashionable women. Some described the absence of normal lines or reactions, calling it unnatural. Yet in society such remarks were ignored. People admired what they saw as discipline. A woman who appeared frozen in grief or calmness was thought superior to one who lived visibly through her face. The contradiction is striking. In an age that claimed to value morality and sincerity, beauty was measured by how well a woman could hide herself. Feelings were meant to be buried, replaced by a mask that resembled death. It is disturbing to imagine gatherings filled with women who looked more like wax figures than human beings, each competing to appear the most lifeless. The demand for doll-like faces also served social control. A woman who never revealed emotions was easier to manage. She did not protest. She did not reveal anger. She did not show desire. By turning emptiness into beauty, society ensured that women presented themselves as passive and compliant. Their very features were shaped into silence. In portraits of the time, this ideal is evident. Painters captured faces with soft, blank expressions, eyes unfocused, lips barely parted. These images were celebrated, hung proudly in parlours and galleries. Families pointed to them as proof of refinement. Few noticed how unnatural they looked, or if they did, they praised it as elegance. Behind closed doors, the strain told a different story. Women struggled with suppressed laughter, with tears that could not be shed, with emotions forced inward. The cost of appearing perfect was carried in silence. The culture did not care. Appearances were everything, and appearances demanded lifelessness. This standard did not fade quickly. Well into the late Victorian years, the doll face remained admired. Some critics called it absurd, but their voices were drowned out by the weight of habit. Generations of women were shaped by the demand to deny themselves. Their own faces turned into objects. The legacy is unsettling, a reminder of how beauty can become a tool of erasure. The expectation that women resemble dolls shows how far Victorian society went in denying female humanity. Beauty was measured not by life, but by the absence of it. The silent, blank mask was praised above joy, sorrow, or sincerity. The price was years of discomfort and loss of expression, paid for the sake of appearing refined. The vision of beauty as a lifeless doll reveals how the era turned women into statues, admired only when they erased themselves. From there, the control extended even further, shaping not just expressions but the very mouths that could reveal feeling. The following demand insisted that true beauty meant lips that did not move at all, as if speech, laughter, and even eating had no place in a perfect woman. The lips of Victorian women carried expectations that went beyond appearance. They were not only to be thin and pale, but also to remain as still as possible. A mouth that moved too freely was thought to betray impulsiveness, or even vulgarity. To be considered beautiful, a woman was expected to smile without showing her teeth, to speak softly with lips barely parted, and to eat so discreetly that her mouth seemed almost unused. The more silent and restrained the lips, the more refined the woman was judged to be. Thin lips became a symbol of purity, while full lips were condemned as base. A mouth that appeared lush or expressive suggested hunger, passion, or other bodily desires, all qualities that Victorian society sought to suppress in women. Manuals on etiquette repeated the same warnings. Wide smiles were improper. Laughter that exposed teeth was crude, and visible chewing was shameful. The mouth became less an organ of speech or nourishment and more an object of discipline. This ideal shaped daily behaviour. Women learned to control their lips in every setting. At home, they were reminded to eat with care, never letting food or utensils touch their lips directly. In public, they were taught to cover their mouths when laughing or coughing. Even conversation was reduced to murmurs, the lips forming words with as little movement as possible. The aim was to create the impression of a mouth that barely functioned, existing as decoration rather than as part of a living body. The consequences of this obsession were strange and sometimes cruel. Some women sought physical methods to enforce stillness. Reports tell of temporary stitches or bindings placed at the corners of the mouth, meant to train lips into a narrow line. Others pressed their lips together with bands of cloth at night, believing that repeated pressure would eventually change their shape. Beauty, in this sense, was an act of suppression, one that left women literally bound in silence. In portraits and photographs from the period, the influence of this standard is visible. Women appear with closed, tight mouths, rarely smiling, often looking severe or blank. The effect was intentional. The less life their lips revealed, the more admired they became. A lively grin might have made them appear human, but it would also have ruined their chance of being seen as refined. Instead, they became objects of solemnity, their mouths frozen into thin, unyielding lines. The training to maintain such restraint was exhausting. Imagine the effort of holding one's mouth in check through meals, conversations, and social visits. A slip of laughter could be remembered and gossiped about. A careless bite might be seen as animal-like. To avoid judgment, women learned to repress natural impulses, reshaping not only their appearance but also their personalities. This standard also reinforced hierarchy. Women of wealth and leisure could afford to practice and maintain these rules. Servants and working-class women, forced to eat quickly or speak loudly in crowded streets, were condemned as coarse. Beauty became another way to divide classes, with stillness reserved for those who could live slowly. For poor women, lips that showed life were evidence of necessity rather than of choice, yet society judged them harshly. The irony of the obsession with lips is that it denies the very functions that make them essential. Lips are for speaking, laughing, eating, and expressing emotion. By demanding that they remain motionless, society stripped women of communication and joy. They were left with mouths that signalled compliance, mouths that looked delicate but served no purpose. The demand for thin, silent lips became another form of control, silencing women in the most literal way possible. The practice was encouraged by popular culture. Novels described heroines with mouths like fine lines, lips pale and unmoving, praised for their modesty. Fashion plates showed women with tight expressions, no hint of a smile. Even advertisements for beauty products emphasized the need for refinement at the mouth. Readers absorbed these messages, repeating them in their own lives. What appeared in print soon became a standard in homes. Behind this ideal was a fear of women's voices. A woman who spoke too much was criticized as improper. One who laughed loudly was condemned as indecent, and one who ate openly was called vulgar. By making the lips a site of strict control, society ensured that women's expressions and appetites were hidden. Their beauty was measured not by their vitality, but by how well they erased themselves. The cost of this denial was significant. Women lost not only comfort but also authenticity. Their mouths no longer expressed their feelings or needs. Instead, they became tools for display, shaped by rules that punish natural human behavior. It is unsettling to imagine gatherings filled with women smiling faintly, speaking quietly, and eating silently, each one carefully hiding the life within her lips. Even within families, these standards created distance. Mothers taught daughters to keep their mouths closed, passing down the same rules that had restricted them. Generations learned that to be valued, they must silence their joy and their hunger. The cycle was self-perpetuating, reinforced by culture, class, and fear of shame. Doctors sometimes observed the results of these practices. Women who restricted their lips for years developed tension in their jaws and difficulty with normal speech. Some suffered from cracked skin or infections caused by bindings and powders, yet these problems were rarely blamed on beauty standards. Instead, they were dismissed as personal weaknesses. The responsibility always fell back on the women themselves. By the end of the century, voices of reform began to question these customs. Some writers mocked the stiffness of fashionable women, describing them as lifeless statues. Others praised natural smiles and laughter as signs of health. But these challenges were slow to spread, and the thin, silent mouth remained an admired feature well into the late Victorian years. The damage had already been done to countless women who had endured years of suppression. The demand for immobile lips shows how far Victorian society went in denying the humanity of women. Their mouths were reduced to narrow lines, stripped of expression, and bound by fear of judgment. Beauty became silence, and silence became virtue. In this way, even the smallest part of the body was turned into a tool of control. The vision of beauty as frozen lips reveals how the era praised absence over presence, stillness over life. From there, the pressure did not stop at the face but extended to the entire body, demanding women present themselves as if they were barely alive at all. The following expectation was even darker. Beauty was measured by how much a woman could erase signs of living, until she seemed like a statue that no longer breathed. The Victorian vision of beauty did not stop at the eyes or the mouth. It expanded into the whole body, demanding that women appear as if they were not truly alive. The ideal woman was described as silent, motionless, and mysterious, her presence resembling more a wax figure than a living human being. Movement was not natural but staged. Every gesture had to look deliberate, graceful, and restrained. To be admired, women were expected to erase all signs of ordinary life, leaving behind only the impression of a carefully sculpted object. This expectation shaped daily routines in ways that seem absurd now. Women were trained to walk slowly, their steps small and measured, so that their bodies gave no impression of haste or urgency. Even when they sat, they were told to avoid shifting, stretching, or fidgeting. Resting became a performance, as if they were figures placed in a gallery. Silence reinforced the image. A woman who moved without sound was praised as elegant. The less she seemed alive, the more others considered her refined. In social gatherings, this stillness created an atmosphere of quiet spectacle. Guests admired women who appeared composed and detached, as if they were above ordinary human needs. A sudden laugh or an unplanned gesture could ruin the illusion. Those who could maintain composure for long hours were celebrated, while others were quietly mocked for failing. The standard was cruel in its demand for constant vigilance. The wax figure became an explicit comparison. Exhibits of wax museums were popular in Victorian times, and people often described beautiful women as resembling the lifelike statues. Their pale skin, stiff posture, and blank expressions echoed what society wanted to see in women at home and in public. The message was clear: the highest form of beauty was to resemble a replica, not a person. This strange form of admiration carried heavy consequences. Women suppressed natural impulses, forcing themselves into a state of unnatural quiet. They avoided gestures of affection that might seem too vivid. They concealed signs of fatigue or discomfort that would remind others they were human. Over time, this denial became second nature, but it came at the cost of authenticity. To live under constant scrutiny was to live in constant performance. Inside the home, daughters were trained to embody this ideal from an early age. Mothers corrected every movement, reminding them to lower their hands gently, to bow their heads slightly, and to walk without sound. Even in private, the rules held weight. Children grew up watching women practice stillness in drawing rooms and parlours, learning that beauty was measured by how little of life one revealed. The control extended into fashion as well. Dresses were heavy, layered, and designed to limit movement. Corsets restricted the body, making breathing shallow and gestures restrained. This physical constraint reinforced the expectation of silence and stillness. Women literally could not move freely, and so society praised them for their composed appearance. What was in truth a restriction was presented as elegance. In portraits, the same vision appears. Women sat for painters or photographers with blank expressions, their bodies posed in statuesque positions. The images became models for others to follow. Homes displayed them proudly, reinforcing the lesson for future generations. The face, the posture, the silence, all confirm that the ideal woman was one who seemed not to live but to exist as an ornament. The irony of this standard is striking. A culture that claimed to value morality and vitality demanded that women erase all traces of both. Real life was treated as crude, while artificial stillness was praised. It is unsettling to imagine drawing rooms filled with women who looked like wax figures, moving rarely, speaking softly if at all, admired for their emptiness. Reports from visitors sometimes expressed unease. observers noted that social gatherings could feel lifeless, with rows of women sitting in silence, each carefully controlling her movements. Yet these accounts were often framed not as criticism, but as admiration. The absence of vitality was reframed as discipline. The culture found ways to praise what, in truth, was denial. The demand for silence and stillness reveals how beauty standards were also forms of control. A woman who moved or spoke freely might reveal independence, energy, or dissatisfaction. By insisting that beauty meant erasure of life, society ensured compliance. Women became ornaments, admired only when they denied themselves. Their worth was measured by how effectively they could disappear into performance. This denial created contradictions within families and marriages. Husbands admired wives who seemed calm and passive, yet they also lived with the reality of women suppressing their true selves. Children saw mothers who moved like statues and learned to measure their own value by the same false standard. Generations were trapped in the same cycle, repeating rules that denied the very essence of life. The obsession with turning women into wax figures was not just aesthetic, but moral. Silence was equated with purity, stillness with virtue. By conflating absence with goodness, society justified the suppression of women's humanity. What should have been signs of vitality, laughter, movement, expression, were treated as sins against beauty. Over time, reformers began to question these expectations. Some writers mocked the lifelessness of fashionable women, pointing out the absurdity of treating stillness as elegance. Yet their voices were drowned out by tradition. The wax figure standard lingered, shaping decades of women's lives. Even as change slowly arrived, the shadow of these rules remained. The vision of beauty as lifelessness shows how far Victorian society went in denying the humanity of women. By demanding silence, immobility, and mystery, it turned them into ornaments for display, stripping away the freedom to live naturally. This was beauty redefined as erasure, with devastating consequences for countless lives. The expectation that women resemble wax statues reveals a chilling truth. Beauty was judged by the absence of humanity. From there, the rules went even further, extending not only to how women looked and moved, but even to how they smelled. The next cruel demand insisted that true beauty carried not a warm or living fragrance, but the cold scent of lifelessness itself. The Victorian obsession with beauty did not end with appearance. It extended into the air itself, demanding that women embody not just a certain look, but a certain smell. Perfume had long been a mark of refinement, but in this era, the most celebrated scent was not the sweetness of flowers or the warmth of spice. Instead, beauty was said to carry the fragrance of coldness. A woman was praised not if she smelled of roses, but if she smelled of absence, of frost, of lifeless things. To be desirable, she was expected to surround herself with a chill rather than a bloom. Rich floral perfumes, once popular, were denounced as vulgar. Scents that were heavy, warm, or sensual were associated with indulgence and excess. Manuals and magazines advised women to avoid them, warning that strong perfume suggested moral looseness. Instead, light scents that evoked purity and detachment became fashionable. Mint, crushed ice, damp wood, and faint minerals were favoured. These did not call attention to the body, but suggested something untouched, distant, and sterile. The practice was as practical as it was unsettling. Small pouches of dried mint leaves were carried in pockets. Bowls of crushed ice or frozen herbs were placed in drawing rooms to release faint chills into the air. Perfume bottles contained diluted solutions of peppermint oil or camphor, leaving behind the suggestion of coldness when dabbed on skin. Women prepared carefully before outings, ensuring that their fragrance matched society's demand for restraint. For those who wanted to demonstrate even greater refinement, the rituals grew stranger. Some women kept small containers of rotting wood, moss, or even decaying animal parts, carefully treated to reduce odour while preserving their symbolic purity. In a twisted logic, lifelessness was equated with virtue. A faint trace of embalmed matter was thought to ward off corruption, as if the body itself needed to be cleansed of its humanity. These boxes were carried in purses or stored discreetly among powders on dressing tables. In public gatherings, the effect was subtle but noticeable. Women passed through halls, leaving behind faint trails of cold, dry scents. Observers noted the difference between those who carried heavy floral perfumes and those who smelled of nothing but mint or faint minerals. The former were criticised as excessive, while the latter were admired as elevated. The judgment was not about natural appeal, but about conformity to an ideal that rejected warmth and life itself. The obsession with cold fragrance also reflected broader anxieties about morality. The Victorians associated warmth with passion and danger, while coldness suggested self-control and purity. To smell of frost was to display restraint. To carry the scent of flowers was to risk accusation of vanity or indulgence. Women absorbed these lessons and reshaped their lives around them, just as they had reshaped their faces and bodies. This expectation carried its own risks. Substances like camphor and arsenic were sometimes added to perfumes, leaving behind faint residues that irritated the skin or even poisoned those who used them too frequently. Yet the dangers were ignored in favour of appearance. Safety was less important than following fashion. Once again, the demand for beauty placed women in quiet danger, a danger accepted as normal. Inside homes, rituals of scent became part of the daily routine. Dressing tables held bowls of dried herbs, bottles of mineral solutions, and boxes of strange powders. Servants were instructed to refresh these items regularly, ensuring the faint aura of coldness never faded. Even clothing was treated with scented waters, leaving behind the impression of frost on fabric. Women moved through rooms as if surrounded by invisible ice, admired not for life, but for the denial of it. The irony of this practice is clear. Perfume, which had once been used to celebrate life and vitality, was transformed into a tool of erasure. Rather than enhancing natural warmth, it disguised it. Rather than highlighting individuality, it suppressed it. The more lifeless a woman smelled, the more she was praised. This reversal reveals the deep contradictions of a society that sought beauty in death rather than in life. For poorer women, these standards were difficult to meet. They could not afford elaborate perfumes or special ingredients. Instead, they improvised with mint leaves, vinegar, or cheap camphor. The faint chill these created was enough to avoid ridicule, though never enough to achieve admiration. Class differences shaped even the air around women, with wealthier families displaying their refinement through exotic, cold fragrances imported from abroad. Doctors occasionally commented on the health effects of these practices. Some noted rashes and breathing problems caused by camphor and mint oils. Others criticised the absurdity of carrying embalmed remains as charms, yet their warnings went largely unheeded. Just as with toxic powders for the skin, the pursuit of beauty outweighed medical advice. The demand for cold fragrance continued, shaping daily life for decades. This standard of scent reveals how far Victorian society pushed the denial of humanity. It was not enough to appear lifeless in face and body. Even the air had to suggest detachment. Women were reduced to symbols of purity, stripped of warmth in every possible way. Their very smell was turned into a statement of suppression. The cultural meaning of these scents was reinforced in literature and art. Writers described heroines whose presence was marked by a faint chill rather than by a blooming fragrance. Painters captured women posed in cold interiors, their beauty echoed by the absence of life around them. These images shaped imagination and habit, convincing society that beauty was synonymous with coldness. The cost of this obsession was more than physical. It shaped the way women thought of themselves. To smell of warmth was to risk shame. To embody coldness was to earn admiration. Day after day, they prepared themselves to live as emblems of restraint. even when the truth of their bodies was otherwise. The denial of life became second nature, absorbed into every breath. In hindsight, the idea that women were praised for smelling lifeless seems absurd, yet it reflects the larger Victorian tendency to value appearance over reality, denial over truth, silence over expression. By surrounding themselves with cold fragrance, women enacted the same erasure that defined every other part of their existence. The expectation that beauty should carry the scent of coldness shows how deeply the Victorian world feared vitality. To them, warmth meant danger, passion, and disorder. Coldness meant control. Women became living statues, not only in sight but in scent. Their beauty was judged not by who they were, but by how effectively they erased all traces of life. The obsession with lifeless fragrance illustrates how beauty standards could extend into even the smallest details of daily life, turning every sense into a site of control. From here, the logic deepened even further. If women were praised for smelling like death, the next expectation was that they should live each day as if preparing for it. Beauty would soon be judged not only by appearance or scent, but by the posture of someone already rehearsing for their own funeral. Beauty in this period demanded that women appear as if life were already leaving them. The highest compliment was given to those who looked like brides awaiting their final breath. A pale face, lips slightly parted, and a body that seemed ready to collapse into eternal rest were praised as marks of elegance. It was not enough to appear delicate or fragile. The ideal was to resemble death itself, to carry into daily life the look of someone preparing for the grave. The preparations to achieve this effect were elaborate. Women painted their faces with layers of powder that drained all warmth from the skin. Arsenic-based cosmetics left them chalk white, erasing signs of blood or vitality. Lips were tinted faintly, not to suggest life, but to mimic the pale coloration of a corpse. Some even practiced keeping their mouths slightly open, a detail copied from the faces of the dead. The stillness of death was not feared but rehearsed. In households where daughters were trained in beauty, the instructions could be chilling. Girls were told to study portraits of the deceased, to notice the calm faces and relaxed postures. They learned that the absence of movement, the slackness of a body no longer breathing, was what society admired most. Rather than preparing for life, they were prepared to perform death. The effect was not hidden. At gatherings, women appeared as if they were already laid out in repose, admired for the perfection of their lifeless display. Weddings offered a striking example of this strange ideal. A bride was described as most beautiful if she looked faint, her features drained of expression, her posture solemn. Guests whispered in approval when a young woman seemed overwhelmed, not with joy, but with a quiet surrender that resembled mourning. The parallels were intentional. Marriage and death were linked in imagery, both demanding that the woman give herself up entirely, leaving behind her individuality. The bride became an ornament, pale and passive, admired not for her vitality but for her willingness to embody loss. The cosmetics industry profited from this obsession. Powders, ointments, and dyes promised to create the appearance of lifelessness. Some contained substances that blurred the natural colour of the skin, while others induced faintness. There were even reports of women using belladonna to widen their eyes and create a vacant, glassy look, echoing the stare of the dead. These practices carried severe risks, yet they spread widely. To look alive was to fail. To look half dead was to succeed. The posture of death was equally important. Women practiced lying still, reclining with hands folded, or sitting with bodies so rigid they resembled effigies. The less they moved, the more they were admired. Even gestures were rehearsed to look subdued. A hand raised too quickly or a step taken too firmly risked breaking the illusion. Every action was reshaped to suggest resignation, as if the woman had already stepped away from the world. Accounts from observers confirm how unsettling this could be. Visitors to drawing rooms described gatherings where women sat motionless, pale and silent, their faces resembling wax figures, their bodies arranged as if for display in a crypt. Yet these descriptions were meant as praise. Writers spoke of the serenity, the refinement, the elegance of such scenes. Few acknowledged the eerie similarity to death chambers. The connection between beauty and mortality was not accidental. In a society preoccupied with morality and control, death became a symbol of ultimate purity. A woman who looked like she was preparing for it was seen as virtuous, untouched by the chaos of desire or passion. To resemble death was to embody submission. By turning this into beauty, society ensured that women presented themselves as symbols of obedience, their humanity stripped away. The ritual spread beyond cosmetics and posture. Perfume, too, was adapted to fit the theme. Scents of mint, camphor, and other cold elements reinforced the aura of lifelessness. Clothing choices supported the image as well. Pale fabrics, veils, and heavy gowns restricted movement, reinforcing the sense of fragility. Everything about the presentation of a woman's body was arranged to suggest that she was already halfway to the grave. Inside homes, the training was relentless. Daughters were corrected if they flushed with laughter or showed too much colour in their faces. They were reminded to keep their lips slack, their eyes unfocused, their posture calm. Mothers encouraged them to think of solemn images, coffins, funerals, or the loss of loved ones to summon the mood required. This was not hidden, but openly discussed, as if rehearsing for death were simply another part of becoming a lady. The results were both tragic and absurd. Women lived their daily lives as if acting out their own funerals, admired for the success with which they erased themselves. Families boasted of daughters who appeared pale and lifeless, calling them refined. Suitors praised brides who looked as if they had already surrendered their spirits. It is disturbing to imagine entire households celebrating the performance of death as beauty. Doctors occasionally protested. They warned that the cosmetics and practices involved were harmful, that fainting or appearing lifeless could signal real illness. Yet their warnings were often ignored. Commerce, tradition, and social pressure outweighed caution. Just as poisoned candy remained in markets, poisoned cosmetics remained in dressing rooms. The cycle of danger continued, sustained by the belief that death-like beauty was the highest form of elegance. In art and literature, the same themes appeared. Paintings depicted women lying pale against dark backgrounds, praised for their stillness and serenity. Poems described brides as beautiful in surrender, comparing them to figures laid out for burial. These cultural products reinforced the idea that beauty and mortality were inseparable, teaching generation after generation to equate lifelessness with refinement. The deeper meaning is clear. By demanding that women resemble the dead, society robbed them of vitality and voice. It was not enough to silence their laughter or restrict their movement. Their very existence was reframed as a rehearsal for disappearance. To be admired, they had to deny life itself. This standard reveals not just cruelty, but fear. Fear of women's independence, fear of their vitality, fear of their humanity. The obsession with death-like beauty shows how far ideals could distort reality. Women were praised not for who they were, but for how effectively they erased themselves. Beauty became synonymous with surrender, with preparing for an end rather than living a life. The cost was immense, paid daily by women who gave up their natural selves in exchange for social approval. The demand that women live as if ready for death captures the darkest side of Victorian beauty. It turned ordinary life into a stage for mourning, stripping away vitality in favour of ritualised stillness. From this foundation, the standards grew even harsher. If women had to erase life itself from their faces and bodies, then the next step was to demand that every detail of their form defy practicality. Beauty would soon be measured not only by lifelessness, but also by proportions so unnatural that they prevented women from standing or working at all. Beauty in this age was not satisfied with lifeless faces and cold scents. It stretched further, demanding that the body itself be reshaped into something impractical, fragile, and unnatural. The more a woman's body defied reality, the more she was admired. Small feet that could barely support weight, fingers so long they looked distorted, and limbs that seemed too delicate for ordinary life were treated as ideals. To appear incapable of labour was not only fashionable but essential. The body became a canvas for exaggerations that mocked usefulness, transforming natural forms into distorted symbols of refinement. The feet were a particular focus. Women were told that the smaller the foot, the greater the beauty. Shoes were often purchased several sizes too small, forcing toes into cramped spaces until walking became painful. Some women even wrapped their feet tightly to shrink them, a practice that caused blisters, swelling, and deformity. The resulting fragility was praised. A woman who stumbled or needed assistance to move was admired for her delicacy. To walk with ease was considered common, while to struggle with every step was viewed as elegant. Hands and fingers followed the same logic. Long, slender fingers were celebrated, even if they appeared unnatural. Conduct manuals praised women whose hands seemed too delicate to perform household tasks. To achieve this effect, some women practiced stretching their fingers or even breaking bones to lengthen them artificially. Injuries were disguised under gloves, while the appearance of frailty was paraded proudly in social gatherings. The irony is clear: what in truth was weakness or deformity was reframed as beauty. Fashion supported these ideals. Gloves were cut to emphasize thinness, with seams so tight they restricted circulation. Rings were chosen to make fingers appear longer, and sleeves were tailored to highlight delicate wrists. Shoes, narrow and stiff, exaggerated the appearance of small feet even as they left women limping. Clothing reinforced the idea that beauty meant denying the body's natural proportions and functions. Inside households, these practices became routine. Mothers inspected their daughters' hands and feet, correcting any sign of robustness. Girls were taught to hide strong grips or steady steps, replacing them with movements that suggested fragility. A firm handshake was condemned, while a limp, weak hand was admired. To appear capable was to risk ridicule. To appear useless was to gain approval. In public, the effects were visible. Women walked slowly, sometimes leaning on companions or canes, not because of illness, but because their shoes and posture prevented normal movement. Their hands were covered, their gestures subdued. Observers praised the effect, noting how refined they looked. What was, in fact, the result of pain and restriction was admired as elegance. Society learned to value distortion over reality. The cruelty of these standards lay in their demands for suffering. Women endured daily discomfort to maintain appearances. They accepted pain as part of beauty, reshaping their bodies against their will. Feet became deformed, hands stiff, and joints damaged. Yet rather than questioning these practices, families encouraged them. Beauty was measured not by health, but by how successfully one erased the signs of natural strength. This obsession also reinforced class divisions. Only wealthy women could afford to adopt such impractical standards. They did not need to walk long distances or work with their hands. Their fragility became a symbol of status, proof that they were free from labour. Poorer women, whose bodies showed the strength of daily work, were condemned as coarse. Beauty, once again, became a tool to mark social boundaries, separating those who could afford weakness from those forced into usefulness. Doctors occasionally criticised these practices. They noted the deformities caused by ill-fitting shoes and the damage to hands from forced stretching, but their warnings were often ignored. Pain was seen as proof of dedication. Women endured it silently, understanding that their value depended on their willingness to sacrifice health for beauty. Even when injuries became permanent, the system offered no sympathy. The suffering was invisible beneath gloves, shoes, and gowns. The cultural influence of these ideals spread through art and literature. Paintings depicted women with impossibly slender fingers, delicate feet, and exaggerated proportions. Writers described heroines who seemed too fragile to move, admired for their impracticality. These images and stories shaped imagination, convincing society that distortion was elegance. Generations grew up believing that reality was vulgar and that beauty required denial. In private, the contradictions were obvious. Women who appeared delicate in public often struggled with pain at home. They removed their shoes to reveal swollen feet, their gloves to show damaged fingers. Yet these realities were hidden from sight. Families ignored them, preferring the image of beauty to the truth of suffering. The home became both a stage for performance and a prison for pain. The demand for impractical beauty reveals a deeper truth about control. By insisting that women reshape their bodies into fragile forms, society ensured their dependence. A woman who could not walk easily, who could not use her hands freely, was a woman who relied on others. Fragility was not only admired, but enforced, turning beauty into a tool of subjugation. The obsession with impractical proportions shows how far ideals could drift from reality. Women were admired not for who they were, but for how effectively they erased their own humanity. The body was no longer a vessel for life, but a canvas for distortion. This denial of reality created a culture where pain was normal, weakness was praised, and strength was condemned. The vision of beauty as impracticality captures the absurdity of the time. Feet too small to stand, fingers too long to work, bodies reshaped into fragile caricatures. These became the hallmarks of refinement. The cost was daily suffering, accepted in silence. It is unsettling to imagine entire societies celebrating deformity as elegance. Yet this was the standard. The demand that women appear impractical reveals the cruelty at the heart of Victorian ideals. By praising fragility, society stripped women of their freedom and health. What should have been sources of strength were turned into symbols of shame. The more unreal they appeared, the more beautiful they were called. The obsession with bodies that could not function shows the extreme lengths to which beauty was pursued. From here, the demand spread to even smaller details. If hands and feet had to deny reality, then even the neck was not safe. The next cruel expectation insisted that a woman's throat remain smooth, unmarked, and impossibly long, with no sign of life's natural folds or movement. The neck was one of the most scrutinized parts of a woman's body, and it carried with it a demand that was as harsh as it was unnatural. Beauty was said to rest in a neck as long and smooth as that of a swan, unbroken by folds, lines, or any sign that the body moved or aged. A graceful neck was prized not for its strength or flexibility, but for its appearance of stillness and fragility. To bend too much, to allow the skin to crease, was to risk being marked as coarse or ordinary. This ideal reshaped daily behaviour. Women were warned never to lower their heads too far, lest folds appear. Reading, writing, or sewing could create creases, so postures had to be corrected constantly. Manuals instructed women to move their heads slowly, to avoid turning sharply, and to keep their necks stretched in deliberate poise. To live under such rules was to live with constant awareness of every movement. At night, the discipline did not end. Devices were designed to hold the head in place while sleeping, forcing the neck into stiff alignment. Some resembled wooden or metal supports, propped against the bed, preventing women from shifting in their rest. Others used padded collars that restricted movement entirely. Sleep, which should have been a time of release, became another rehearsal of beauty. Women woke with stiff muscles, but their skin bore fewer lines, and that was all that mattered. Fashion reinforced these demands. High collars, lace chokers, and stiff bodices framed the neck, emphasizing length and smoothness. fabrics pressed against the skin to flatten it, while accessories drew attention to the absence of lines. Portraits captured women with elongated throats, their heads tilted slightly to show off unbroken expanses of pale skin. The illusion of the swan neck became one of the most powerful symbols of refinement. The cost of this standard was heavy. Restricting movement caused tension and pain. Women developed stiff shoulders and headaches from the constant effort to hold their heads upright. The use of supports at night left some with lasting discomfort, yet these consequences were dismissed as the price of beauty. Just as with tight shoes or toxic powders, pain was reframed as elegance. The cruelty was compounded by its futility. Necks, like all parts of the body, naturally fold and crease with movement and age. To demand otherwise was to fight against biology itself, yet society insisted that women erase these signs, treating natural marks as shameful. The result was a culture where women hid or punished their own bodies in pursuit of an unattainable standard. Class played a role as well. Women of wealth, who could afford to remain idle, were best able to preserve smooth necks. They avoided the work that bent spines or strained muscles. Their stillness became proof of refinement. Poorer women, forced to labour, bore the natural signs of movement and were condemned for them. The standard reinforced divisions, equating fragility with superiority and strength with vulgarity. Accounts from observers often admired women whose necks seemed impossibly long and flawless. Writers described them as swan-like, graceful, and serene. The comparison to animals was meant as praise, though it revealed how far from humanity the ideal had drifted. A neck that looked alive, carrying the marks of work or laughter, was less admired than one that looked frozen, like a sculpture. Inside homes, the rituals became routine. Daughters were corrected for slouching, reminded to keep their heads high, their necks stretched. Mirrors were used to inspect folds, and mothers scolded any sign of creasing. The discipline was relentless, shaping habits that lasted into adulthood. The body was trained not to live naturally but to conform to performance. The deeper meaning of this standard reveals itself clearly. By demanding smooth, fragile necks, society reinforced silence and passivity. A woman who could not lower her head freely could not act freely. Her body was constrained, her movements restricted. Beauty became another form of control, pressing women into compliance not only in mind but in flesh. The obsession with the swan neck also reflected a fear of time. Lines and folds were signs of age, reminders that life moved forward. By erasing them, women were forced to act as if they were timeless, untouched by change. Beauty was defined as denial of age and denial of movement, turning women into living statues. The irony of this expectation is striking. In public, women were admired for their smooth necks, praised as refined. In private, they endured discomfort, sleeping in restraints, moving cautiously through daily tasks. Their lives were shaped by fear of creases that no one could avoid forever. The standard demanded sacrifice without mercy, and the sacrifice was accepted in silence. The demand for flawless necks shows how far ideals could distort the body. Women were not allowed to live naturally. They were required to punish themselves in pursuit of illusions, their health and comfort dismissed as trivial. What should have been signs of humanity were turned into marks of failure. The obsession with erasing lines at the throat illustrates how beauty was built on denial. Women were admired not for who they were, but for how completely they could hide the truth of their bodies. To live under such standards was to live as an object, stripped of freedom, reshaped into a symbol. The demand for swan-like necks captures the absurdity and cruelty of the time. Beauty became another word for suffering, and suffering became invisible behind the smooth mask of skin. From there, the standard spread even further, reaching into smaller details of the body. If the neck had to remain cold and lifeless, then so too did the ears. The next expectation insisted that a woman's ears should never show warmth. but instead remain as cold and unfeeling as stone. The ears, though small and often overlooked, became another site of control and judgment. Beauty was not only about how they looked, but about how they felt to the touch. A woman's ears were expected to remain cold, as if untouched by life. Warmth was condemned. It suggested feeling, passion, or sensitivity, qualities that were seen as dangerous, as just cold ears, on the other hand, were praised as signs of purity and restraint. What should have been a trivial detail became a measure of virtue. The belief was enforced with strange rituals. Women were advised to test the temperature of their ears before leaving home. Some used mirrors not only to check their appearance, but also to press their fingers lightly against their skin, judging whether warmth might betray them. If their ears felt too warm, they turned to remedies. Ice was the most common. Pieces were pressed to the ears, numbing the flesh until it felt lifeless. The sting of the cold was endured in silence, accepted as the cost of beauty. Other methods were equally unsettling. Some women used herbal compresses soaked in cold water, applied repeatedly to keep their ears chilled. Others wore small metal clips cooled in basins before gatherings,